Don't touch him. Emily Carter whispered it first. Then she said it again louder, standing over a bleeding, 64-year-old man she had known for less than 3 hours. 3 drunk men in expensive clothes looked down at her, 90 pounds cracked lips, hollow eyes, and laughed. She didn't move. She didn't run. She spread her arms wide over Jack Morgan's broken body and said it one final time, loud enough for the whole parking lot to hear. I said don't touch him. If you're watching this story for the first time, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. Emily Carter had one rule she had written in the back of her mind so many times it had become something close to scripture, the kind of thing you stop questioning because questioning it could get you killed. The rule was this: stay invisible. Don't speak unless someone speaks to you first. Don't make eye contact. Don't sit too long in any one place. Don't let anyone remember your face. And above all else, never under any circumstances get involved in someone else's trouble. She had kept that rule for 11 months. She had kept it through a brutal January when the temperature in Kingman, Arizona dropped below freezing, and she slept in a bus shelter with a torn sleeping bag and a broken zipper. She had kept it through a spring when a man twice her size tried to take the $20 bill she had earned, scrubbing bathroom floors at a gas station, and she had simply let it go rather than fight. She had kept it through a summer so hot the asphalt burned through the soles of her shoes, and through a fall when she watched another girl her age get dragged into an alley and made herself look away because looking would have meant getting involved, and getting involved meant becoming a target. 19 years old, 87 pounds. Blonde hair she hadn't washed properly in 3 weeks. Eyes that had learned to see everything without appearing to see anything at all. That was Emily Carter, and for 11 months the rule had kept her alive. The night it all unraveled began like most of her nights did, with hunger. She hadn't eaten since the morning, and even that had only been half a granola bar she found near a park bench. By 9 o'clock she could feel her hands shaking, that particular kind of hollow shakiness that isn't really about weakness, but about the body starting to eat itself from the inside. She had learned to recognize the feeling. She had also learned that the roadside diner on Route 66, a place called Patsy's, with a flickering neon sign, and a cook who sometimes left the back door propped open, occasionally had food in the dumpster that was still good. She wasn't proud of it. She was past being proud. She came around the back of the building at just after 9:15, moving quietly the way she always moved, staying close to the wall, checking corners before she turned them. The dumpster was 8 feet away. She was almost there when she heard the voice. "You hungry?" She stopped. Her entire body went rigid. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run, to pretend she hadn't heard, to melt back into the dark and become invisible again. But something made her turn. There was a man sitting on an overturned plastic crate near the back door of the diner. Old, she could see that immediately. Maybe mid-60s, gray hair, the kind that had probably been very dark once worn a little long behind the ears. He had a gray beard neatly trimmed, and he was wearing a black leather vest over a heavy flannel shirt, and the vest had patches on it, but in the dim light she couldn't read them. He was eating a piece of pie directly from the plate with a plastic fork, and he was looking at her with the kind of calm, unhurried expression that was rarer than gold out here. The expression of a person who wasn't afraid of her and wasn't trying to take anything from her. Emily didn't answer. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "I've been watching you check the perimeter for about 40 seconds. You've got good instincts." He paused. "I've got a plate of biscuits and gravy I can't finish. You'd be doing me a favor." She stared at him. "I'm not interested in anything you want in return," he said. "I'm 64 years old and my back hurts, and I'm eating pie alone behind a diner at 9:30 on a Tuesday. I don't have much of an agenda." Something about the flatness of that last sentence made her breath catch, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Almost like being a person. "What kind of biscuits?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "The kind from a can, but Patsy makes good gravy." She sat down. Not close, she kept 4 feet between them, close enough to reach the food, far enough to run. He pushed the plate toward her without comment and went back to his pie, and he didn't watch her eat, which was a thing she hadn't realized she needed until he did it. She ate the biscuits. She ate them fast, the way she always ate the way you eat when you've learned that food can disappear and must be consumed before it does. When she looked up, he still wasn't watching her. He was looking at the sky now. "I'm Jack," he said. "Emily." "Nice to meet you, Emily." He said it like he meant it, like her name was something worth saying carefully. She looked down at the plate. "Thank you. Don't mention it." They sat in silence for a minute. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. That in itself was strange. Emily had learned that silence with strangers almost always had a texture, anticipation or threat, or calculation lurking underneath it. This silence was just silence. "How long?" he asked. She looked up. "On the street," he said. "How long?" She considered not answering. But something about the way he asked it, not with pity, not with the particular hungry curiosity some people had, the kind that meant they were cataloging her misfortune for their own entertainment, made her answer. 11 months. He nodded slowly. "Arizona the whole time. Mostly, I came from Tucson." "You've got family there?" "No." He didn't ask why. Most people asked why. The why was the part people always wanted, as if the reason mattered more than the reality, as if having a sufficient explanation would make the whole thing more comfortable for them. Jack Morgan didn't ask why. He just nodded again and finished his pie. "You need a jacket," he said. "November nights out here get mean." "I'm fine." He looked at her, and she could tell from his expression that they both knew she wasn't fine, and that he wasn't going to argue with her about it, and that he wasn't going to pretend he believed her either. He just stood up, went to a battered saddlebag sitting next to a motorcycle parked 10 feet away, and came back with a jacket. Not a cheap jacket, a real one. Heavy canvas lined with something warm, the kind of jacket that costs money. He set it down on the crate between them without making it a gesture. "Found it at a swap meet," he said. "Too small for me." She picked it up. It wasn't too small for him. It would have fit him fine. But she put it on and didn't say anything, because sometimes grace requires letting people have their small dignities. "Better?" he asked. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Better." They talked for another hour. That was the part that surprised her most, not the food, not the jacket, but the conversation. Jack Morgan talked to her like she was a person, not like a charity case, not like a problem to be solved, not like a curiosity. He asked her what she thought about things. He told her about places he'd ridden. He made a dry, understated joke about Arizona winters that caught her off guard, and she laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, the kind she'd almost forgotten she was capable of, and the sound of it startled her so badly she had to look away. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah." She cleared her throat. "Yeah, it's been a while since I laughed." "I noticed." She looked at him. "That doesn't bother you." "What, that you laughed?" She stopped. She didn't have the right word for what she was. Broken didn't feel right. Lost felt closer, but still not quite. "That I'm like this." Jack was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't bother me." He paused. "I've known a lot of people like you, Emily, not the same situation, but the same eyes. People who had to get very hard, very fast, because the world didn't give them the option to be soft." He turned to look at her directly for the first time. That's not a flaw, that's survival. She had to look away again. It was 10:50 when the SUV pulled into the parking lot, not the back lot. The front, she heard it before she saw it, the heavy idle of an expensive engine, and then the slamming of doors, 3 of them in quick succession, and then voices. Loud voices. The kind of loud that comes from men who have been drinking and have never once in their lives had to be quiet because they couldn't afford to be quiet. She heard them before they came around the corner. "Told you this place would be closed, Ty." "It's not closed. I can see a light." "Dude, it's a diner. Last call was like 2 hours ago." 3 men came around the side of the building. They were young mid-20s, and they were wearing the casual, expensive clothing of men who'd never had to think about price tags. The one in the middle was taller than the other 2, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of someone who had grown up being told the world was his. They saw Jack first. "Hey," the tall one said. "Old man, the diner's still open." Jack looked up. "Closed at 9, he said calmly. Patsy might still be inside, but I wouldn't count on it. Who's Patsy? The owner. The tall one, Tyler, the others kept calling him Tyler, looked at Emily. She felt the shift in attention, like a physical thing, the way you feel when the temperature changes. His eyes moved over her in the particular assessing way she'd learned to recognize and dread. What are you doing back here? He said. Nothing, fucking, Emily said. She kept her voice flat. Flat was safer than anything else. You homeless? Tyler, one of the other men said. Come on, man. I'm just asking. He stepped a little closer. You homeless? Like sleeping back here? She's a guest, Jack said. Tyler turned to look at him. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. He was drunk enough that his reactions were half a second behind his thoughts, and she could see him processing the fact that this old man had answered a question that hadn't been addressed to him. What did you say? I said she's a guest, Jack repeated. His voice hadn't changed at all. Same even tone, same unhurried cadence. She's sitting with me. That means she's a guest. Tyler stared at him. Something about being answered that way quietly without apology by a man who clearly wasn't afraid of him seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. He was used to deference or aggression. Calm didn't fit his framework. You don't look like you're anybody's host, Tyler said. Looks can be misleading. One of the other men laughed nervously. The third one was already looking at his phone, and Emily could see that he was at least partly sober and understood that something was tilting in a direction he didn't want it to tilt. Maybe we should just go, Ty, the third one said. There's a place on... I want a coffee, Tyler said, and there was something childish and dangerous in the way he said it, the tone of a person who has never not gotten what he wanted. Let me just see if the place is actually closed. He moved toward the back door. It was a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but he walked directly toward Emily to do it close enough that she had to pull her knees in, and as he passed, she saw it wasn't entirely accidental. Back off, Emily said. The words came out before she decided to say them. Tyler stopped. He turned and looked at her with genuine surprise, the way you'd look at a piece of furniture that had spoken. What did you just say to me? I said back off. She met his eyes, kept her voice steady even though her hands were not. You walk close enough to step on me on a purpose. So back off. Something crossed Tyler's face that she recognized immediately. She'd seen it before in other men, in other situations, and she knew exactly what it meant. It was the expression of a person who had decided that a line had been crossed and that the person who crossed it needed to understand the consequences of that decision. You're telling me to back off, he said slowly. You. He looked at her the way he might look at something small and fragile. You're going to tell me what to do. Tyler. The third man's voice was sharp now. Come on, let's go. Nobody's going anywhere, Tyler said, and he turned to Jack. Old man, tell your guest to watch her mouth. Jack stood up. He didn't stand up fast. He stood up the way men his age stand up carefully, one hand braced on his knee, straightening with the particular deliberateness of a body that has earned its stiffness. But when he was fully upright, something about him changed. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to. But the temperature around him changed. Her mouth is fine, Jack said. Time for you boys to head out. Boys, Tyler repeated. He almost laughed. Did you just say boys? I did. How old are you, man? Old enough to know how this ends if you don't leave. The second man, the one who'd been laughing nervously, finally seemed to register what was happening, and his nervous laugh disappeared. He stepped back. Not Tyler. Tyler was very drunk and very used to winning and very unused to the particular quality of stillness Jack Morgan was projecting. How does it end? Tyler said. With you leaving, Jack said simply. One way or another. Tyler moved first. It wasn't a considered decision. It was the move of a drunk man with no impulse control and too much certainty about his own size. He shoved Jack both hands on his chest hard, and Jack was 64 years old with a bad back, and he went down hard on the asphalt, one arm, catching his weight badly, and Emily heard the sound his elbow made when it hit the ground. Jack, she was on her feet. Stay back, Jack said, but his voice had pain in it now, and Tyler was already stepping forward. That's what I thought, Tyler said. Old man wanted to play it tough. He kicked Jack in the ribs. Emily didn't decide to do what she did next. Decisions are things you make when you have time to think, and she had no time. What she did was move. She crossed the 4 feet between her and Jack in less than a second, and she put herself between Tyler Holloway and the man on the ground, and she spread her arms, and she said the words that had started all of this. Don't touch him. Tyler looked at her. He was breathing hard through his nose, and his face had gone to that place that drunk violence goes when it's already committed. Move, he said. No. I said move, and I said no. She heard one of the other men say something low and urgent. She heard Tyler say something back that she couldn't make out. And then his hand connected with the side of her face with enough force to send her sideways, and the world tilted, and she was on her knees next to Jack, and she had a single clear thought before the next hit landed. She thought, I'm not moving. She had kept her rule for 11 months. Stay invisible. Never get involved. Never be someone's problem. She broke it now. She pulled herself back over Jack's body and held on, and the men kept coming, and she held on, and the pain started somewhere she couldn't locate and spread outward like heat, and still she held on. She heard Jack's voice rough with pain saying her name. She heard one of Tyler's friends saying, stop, man, stop. We need to go, but Tyler wasn't stopping. She heard her own breathing, ragged and strange. She felt something crack in her side. Then again, the world started to go gray at the edges. She was still holding on when she heard Jack's voice change. Not louder, just different, deliberate, like he was putting words somewhere specific. He had something in his hand. She couldn't see it clearly. A radio maybe, small and black. She heard his voice steady despite everything. I'm down. Send the club. She didn't know what that meant. She had no idea what that meant. The gray at the edges was becoming the whole picture now. And the last thing she felt before she lost consciousness was Jack's hand on her arm, and the last thing she heard was his voice quieter than everything else just for her. You hold on, Emily Carter, he said. You hold on. She held on. And somewhere beyond the dark that was coming for her in 100 garages and driveways and roadside bars scattered across Arizona and Nevada and California and New Mexico, an unknown number of men heard 3 words come across a frequency they monitored every night of their lives, and every single one of them set down what they were holding and walked toward their motorcycles. She came back to consciousness in pieces. Not all at once, the way it happens in movies where someone opens their eyes and the world snaps into focus and they say something meaningful. It happened in fragments. A sound first, the low persistent hum of machines. Then a smell, that specific antiseptic smell that meant hospital and meant she was somewhere with a roof, which her brain processed as safe before the pain hit her and reminded her that nothing about her situation was particularly safe. She tried to breathe and something in her left side stopped her. Not pain exactly, more like a wall, like someone had installed a door in her chest that only opened halfway and locked there. Easy. A voice. Female. Close. You've got a chest tube. Don't try to take a deep breath yet. Let your body figure it out. Emily opened her eyes. A nurse 40's no-nonsense, the kind of face that had seen enough that it didn't perform surprise anymore, was checking something on a monitor beside her bed. She looked down at Emily with an expression that was clinical and warm at the same time. There you are, she said. You decided to come back. Emily's mouth was desert dry. Jack, she said. The man they brought in with you, is he? He's alive. The nurse said it fast, understanding immediately that nothing else mattered to this girl right now. He's 2 rooms down, broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, concussion. He's been asking about you since they let him sit up. Emily closed her eyes again. Something in her chest that had nothing to do with the tube released. What? She stopped, swallowed, tried again. What time is it? 5:40 in the morning. She'd been out for hours. Someone needs to pay for this, Emily said. She wasn't sure exactly why she said it. It came out without calculation, just a flat statement of something that felt true. The nurse was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Honey, I think that's already in progress. She paused. Have you looked out the window? Emily turned her head. The window was to her right. Through it, she could see the sky going the early gray of almost dawn. She could also see in the parking lot below and the street beyond it, and the highway visible further out lights. Dozens of them. Headlights and brake lights and the amber glow of engines idling. And she could hear faintly through the glass a low rumble that hadn't been there when she'd arrived, the collective sound of many engines running and then cutting off running and then cutting off as vehicle after vehicle arrived and found a place to stop. What is that? Emily said. The nurse set down her clipboard. Your friend made a phone call, she said. Apparently someone answered. The first of them arrived at 6:10 in the morning. Not dozens. Not a group. One man coming through the front entrance of Kingman Medical Center with the particular walk of someone who owns whatever room he enters, not through aggression, but through absolute certainty. He was in his 50s, built wide through the shoulders, with a dark beard going gray at the corners, in a black leather vest identical in style to the one Jack had been wearing. His name was Dennis Rourke, and he was the regional president of the Southwest chapter, and the first thing he did when he found Jack's room was stand in the doorway for 3 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "You look terrible." Jack was sitting up in the hospital bed with his right arm in a splint and the particular careful posture of a man with cracked ribs who has learned not to move suddenly. He looked at Dennis with the same calm he'd had in the parking lot, pain and all. "I've looked worse," Jack said. "Who did it?" "3 men, young, rich probably. One of them is named Tyler." Jack shifted carefully. "The girl is 2 rooms down, broken ribs, collapsed lung. She's the one who needs looking after Dennis." "What girl?" "Emily Carter, 19 years old. She was behind the diner when they came. She didn't have to do anything." Jack stopped, took a shallow breath. "She threw herself over me. Those ribs, those are from when she was on top of me. She took what was meant for me." Dennis Rourke looked at Jack for a long moment. "How old did you say? 19 and homeless, 11 months on the street?" Dennis turned and looked at the wall, the particular look of a man recalibrating. Then he took out his phone. The calls he made in the next 40 minutes would be replicated across 6 states. By 7 in the morning, Emily could hear them. Not loud. That was the thing that struck her. When she thought about it later, she had expected loud. She had expected motorcycles tearing through the parking lot, the theatrical rumble of 100 engines announcing themselves. What she heard instead was the steady accumulation of sound. Engine after engine cutting off as it arrived. Boots on pavement. Low voices. Not a crowd noise, but something more organized than that, the sound of men who knew how to move in groups, who had their own internal order, who didn't need to perform their presence, because the presence itself was enough. Her nurse, Angela, she'd told Emily, her name was Angela, came in at 7:15, with a look on her face that Emily had never seen before in a hospital employee. "I need to tell you something," Angela said. "Okay." "There are currently," she paused, consulting her phone, "somewhere between 80 and 100 motorcycles in our parking lot and surrounding streets. The hospital administrator has been on the phone with the police department since 6:30, and there's a man outside your door who says his name is Dennis and who would like if you're willing to speak with you." Emily stared at her. "He's not," Angela stopped herself, apparently deciding against whatever reassurance she'd been planning. "He's been completely respectful. They all have. I want you to know that. But I also want you to know that you don't have to see anyone you don't want to see." Emily thought about this for about 4 seconds. "Send him in," she said. Dennis Rourke walked into her room and pulled a chair up to her bedside and sat down with the careful economy of movement of a man who didn't waste anything. Not words, not time, not gesture. He looked at her with an expression she could read clearly. It was assessment, but not cold. He was measuring something. She just wasn't sure what. "Emily Carter," he said. "Dennis Rourke," she said back. Something shifted in his expression. "Jack told you my name?" "No, I heard you talking to someone in the hallway." She held his gaze. "I've had to learn to pay attention to what's around me." He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "Jack says you put yourself on top of him." "He was down. I didn't think. I just—" She stopped. There wasn't really an explanation that didn't sound either stupid or grandiose. "He bought me dinner and talked to me like a person. I wasn't going to stand there and watch someone hurt him." Dennis was quiet. "That's it," he said finally. "That's your whole reason. Isn't that enough?" Something moved across his face very briefly that might have been emotion if you were watching closely enough. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful, solid composure she was beginning to think was his natural face. "Yes," he said, "it is." He stood up, and before he left, he said one more thing. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was reading a weather report. "Nobody who was there that night and is walking away from this, Emily. I want you to know that. Not the ones who did this, and not anyone who thought they were going to make it disappear." He put the chair back where he'd found it. "You just rest. We'll handle the outside." She didn't ask him what handling the outside meant. She wasn't sure she needed to. By 9 o'clock, the Kingman Medical Center parking lot had become something that the hospital administrator, a careful man named Gerald Pence, who had worked in healthcare administration for 22 years, would later describe in an interview as the most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed in his professional life. There were 240 motorcycles. The count kept changing. It had been 110 at 8, 180 at 8:40. By 9:15, when the first news van arrived from a Flagstaff station, someone tried to count and stopped at 260 because the line was still moving. They weren't blocking the entrance. That was the first thing the arriving police sergeant noticed. They had organized themselves without anyone appearing to direct them to leave the emergency entrance, the main entrance, and the ambulance bay completely clear. They were parked in rows with the precision of a military formation, bikes angled and spaced evenly, engines off, men standing quietly in clusters. Not drinking, not fighting, not yelling, standing. Sergeant Karen Altman, 18 years on the Kingman force, and not a person who shook easily, called it in and then walked up to the nearest cluster and addressed the largest man present. "I'm going to need to understand what's happening here," she said. The man she spoke to was tall, with a silver beard and arms covered in faded ink, and he looked at her with mild, patient eyes and said, "One of ours was hurt, and a girl who protected him was hurt. We're here. Here to do what, exactly?" He seemed to think about this. "To be here," he said finally. "That's all." She called for 2 additional units and established a perimeter, and then stood at the edge of it and watched, and over the next 3 hours she would come to understand that the man had told her the exact truth. They were simply there. Present. A statement made entirely through mass and stillness in the refusal to leave. Her phone rang at 9:50. It was the mayor's office. Inside the hospital, none of this was visible to Emily, but all of it was audible. The sound had changed from the arrival noise of the early morning to something she could only describe as a kind of weighted quiet, a quiet that had volume to it. If that made any sense, the way a held breath in a room full of people is louder than any sound. Angela came in every hour. On her 3rd visit at around 10, she sat down instead of just checking the monitors and leaving. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "What did you do before?" Angela said. "Before the street. You're 19. You were somewhere before." Emily looked at the ceiling. "I aged out of foster care," she said. 18 and out. That's how it works. I had a room for exactly 3 days after my birthday, and then the placement ended, and I had $40 in a garbage bag with my clothes in it." Angela absorbed this. "And you've been out here since 11 months. Do you have any family?" "No." Angela nodded slowly. "And last night," she stopped. "Last night you had an exit. When those men showed up, you could have gone." "I know. Why didn't you?" Emily thought about it the way she'd been thinking about it since she'd come back to herself, turning it over, looking for the part that made rational sense. Because she was a practical person. She had learned to be practical, and throwing yourself over a stranger for no material reason was not a practical decision. "He talked to me for 2 hours, she said. "And the whole time, the whole 2 hours, he never once made me feel like a problem he was trying to solve." She paused. "You know how rare that is? Just being talked to like you're a person who exists for their own reasons, and not because someone needs to feel good about helping you." Angela was quiet. "He talked to me like I mattered," Emily said. "And then someone tried to hurt him, and I couldn't." She turned her head to look at Angela. "I couldn't be someone who watched that happen to someone who'd been kind to me." Angela pressed her lips together and looked at the window and didn't say anything for a moment. "The man outside your door," she said finally. "Dennis, he came back about 20 minutes ago. He said to tell you when you were ready that he'd like you to meet someone." "Who?" "He didn't say." She stood up. "He also said to tell you, and I'm quoting here, the 3 men who did this have been identified. Their names are Tyler Holloway, Marcus Webb, and Connor Briggs. By tonight, those names will be known to law enforcement in 4 states. Angela paused. "I don't know what that means exactly, but he seemed to think you'd want to hear it." Emily felt something in her chest that wasn't the chest tube. "Tyler Holloway," she repeated. "You know that name?" One of them kept calling him Ty. She closed her eyes. "I knew he had money, the way he walked, the way he talked to people, like inconvenience was something other people experienced." Angela nodded. "Dennis also said," and again quoting, Tell her she doesn't have to worry about the bill. Emily looked at her. Hospital bill. Angela clarified. He said it's handled. I don't need, honey. Angela's voice was kind but firm. Your lung collapsed. You have 2 broken ribs, one of which displaced. You've been unconscious for 6 hours. Let someone help you. Emily swallowed, said nothing. I'll send Dennis in, Angela said. The person Dennis wanted her to meet wasn't what she expected. She had been braced for another version of him, large patch the physical presence of someone used to being listened to. The man who came through her door at 11:15 was 61 years old and slim and wore glasses and carried a leather briefcase, and his name was Gerald Brooks. He was a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, as it would turn out. He had been the legal counsel for 3 Southwest chapters for the past 19 years, and he had argued in front of the Arizona Supreme Court, and he had a particular specialty in cases where violence had been committed by individuals whose families believed money could determine outcomes. Miss Carter, he said, pulling the chair close, I'll be brief because you need to rest. I'm here because Jack Morgan asked me to be here, and Dennis Rourke confirmed it. You have the right to your own representation, and I want you to understand that I'm not trying to tell you what to do. He opened the briefcase. But I want to walk you through what we know about Tyler Holloway, and I want you to know it before anyone else tries to talk to you. What do you know? Emily said. Brooks set a photograph on the bed beside her, not a surveillance photo, a newspaper photo from what looked like a society page. A young man in a blazer at some kind of fundraiser, smiling the smile of someone who had never experienced an unfavorable outcome. Tyler Holloway, Brooks said, 26 years old, son of Richard Holloway, who owns Holloway Properties and 3 regional construction firms with combined revenues north of $400 million annually. He let that land. Tyler has 2 prior incidents in his record. Both involved assault. Both were resolved before trial. Both resulted in civil settlements with the victims. He paused. You're the first person who has been seriously enough injured that the medical documentation makes a quiet settlement complicated. Emily looked at the photograph. How many victims? She said. That we know of 2, that we suspect. He paused. More. And they paid everyone. His father paid everyone. She looked at Brooks. What does Richard Holloway know about last night? He knows, Brooks said quietly. He's known since approximately 4 this morning. He has 2 attorneys already en route to Kingman. And Tyler. Tyler was taken into custody at 2 a.m. He's out on bond as of an hour ago. Brooks looked at her steadily. His father posted it. Emily absorbed this. They're going to offer you money, Brooks said. I want you to be ready for that. It may happen through an intermediary. It may come with language that sounds like sympathy. But it will be an offer designed to make this go away before charges are formalized. He closed the briefcase. I want you to know your options before that conversation happens. Whatever you decide, I will support it. But I want you to decide from a position of information, not surprise. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sound that had been present all morning shifted slightly. She noticed it the way you notice a sound-changing pitch. Not dramatic, but undeniable. More engines arriving, or engines that had been running starting up. She couldn't tell. How many people are out there? She said. Brooks looked toward the window. Last I heard, the estimate was close to 400. Emily closed her eyes. Opened them. They came because of Jack, she said. They came because of Jack, Brooks agreed. And because of you. They don't know me. No, he picked up his briefcase. But they know what you did. And for these particular men, Miss Carter, he paused at the door. That's more than enough. After he left, Emily lay still and listened to the sound outside and thought about Tyler Holloway's face in that moment when she'd said, don't touch him. The genuine surprise, the recalibration, the way her refusal to be invisible had simply not computed for him. She thought about what Brooks had said. 2 prior victims, 2 settlements, a father with enough money to make problems disappear. She thought about those other 2 people who had taken money and stayed quiet, and she didn't judge them. She knew what it was to need money. She knew that sometimes survival looked like swallowing something bitter and walking away. But she also thought about something Jack had said to her in that hour behind the diner in the middle of a conversation that had wandered in the easy way conversations do when nobody has an agenda. He'd been talking about something else entirely, about a road he used to ride through Nevada, about the particular way the desert looks at dusk, and he'd said almost offhandedly, "The thing about being honest is it costs you every time. But the thing about not being honest is it costs you everything. Just takes longer." She hadn't known then why that stuck with her. She knew now. At 2 in the afternoon, a nurse she hadn't seen before came in and said there was a phone call for her at the nurse's station. When she asked who was calling, the nurse looked slightly uncomfortable. "He says his name is Richard Holloway," the nurse said. "He says it's urgent." Emily looked at her IV line, looked at the window, could still hear them out there, 400 men who had driven through the night and the morning, because one of theirs had said 3 words on a radio frequency they all monitored. "Tell him," Emily said carefully, "that I'm not available." The nurse blinked. "Should I take a message?" "No." Emily settled back against the pillow. "He can talk to my attorney." The nurse left, and Emily Carter, who had kept herself invisible for 11 months, who had spent nearly a year making herself as small and silent and unnoticeable as possible, stared at the ceiling of her hospital room and understood with absolute clarity that that particular era of her life was over. She had stepped in front of something the night before, not just in front of the men who were swinging, in front of the version of herself who ran. And that version of herself, the girl who looked away, who let things happen, who survived by being nobody, she'd left her behind in that parking lot in Kingman, Arizona. What came next, she didn't know. But when Gerald Brooks had asked her what she wanted to do, she had not hesitated. She wanted to know who else Tyler Holloway had hurt. She wanted their names, and she wanted him to stand in a room where his father's money didn't determine the outcome. Outside, the sound continued. 400 engines worth of silence. 400 men who hadn't been asked to come and hadn't been given a reason to leave. And in a house in Phoenix, Richard Holloway put down the phone and sat in his study for a long time, staring at nothing. His 2 attorneys were sitting across from him, and one of them cleared his throat and said, "The situation is more complicated than we initially." "I know what the situation is," Richard said. He was quiet for another moment. "Get me everything you can find on the girl," he said. "I want to know who she is. I want to know who she has. I want to know every single thing about her that could be relevant." His attorney nodded and made a note. "And Tyler," the other one said. Richard Holloway looked at his hands. "My son needs to understand," he said slowly, "that this time is different." He paused. "I just don't know yet if he's capable of understanding that." Richard Holloway's attorneys arrived in Kingman at 4:17 in the afternoon in a black Mercedes that cost more than most people in that town made in 3 years. Their names were Patterson and Grail, and they had between them 41 years of experience making problems disappear, and they walked into the hospital with the particular confidence of men who had never once sat across from a problem they couldn't price. Gerald Brooks was waiting for them in the lobby. He was sitting in one of the plastic chairs near the entrance, with his briefcase on his knee and his glasses on and a cup of coffee in his hand, and when they walked in, he stood up without hurrying and extended his hand and said, "Gerald Brooks, I represent Emily Carter. I assumed you'd be coming today." Patterson, the senior of the 2 silver-haired and deliberate, looked at him with the careful appraisal of a man recalculating. "You're already retained," he said. "As of this morning." "She's 19 years old and homeless," Grell said. "Not unkindly, just factually the way you'd read a line from a report." "How is she retaining counsel?" "Pro bono," Brooks said pleasantly. "I find the case compelling." He gestured toward the cluster of chairs. "Shall we sit? I think we can save ourselves some time if we're honest about what each of us is actually here for." Patterson sat. Grell remained standing for a moment, then sat. "Our client," or Patterson began, "is genuinely concerned about—" "Your client is concerned about exposure," Brooks said, "which is reasonable. His son committed felony assault resulting in serious bodily injury, and there is security camera footage from the diner, medical documentation consistent with the assault, and 2 eyewitnesses who have already given statements to the Mojave County Sheriff's Office." He set down his coffee. "I've reviewed the 2 prior incident files. I know about the settlements. I know the language that was used. And I want to be very clear with you, as a professional courtesy, that Emily Carter is not in a position where money solves her problem. Her problem is that she almost died, and what she wants from that is accountability, not compensation." Patterson and Grail exchanged a look. "Everyone has a number," Grail said. "Emily Carter doesn't," Brooks said. And the way he said it quietly without emphasis, the way you state something that is simply true, made both men go still. Across town in the Mojave County Sheriff's substation, something was happening that Richard Holloway's attorneys did not yet know about. Connor Briggs had walked in at 3:45 in the afternoon. Not with a lawyer, without one. He had driven himself to the substation in his own car and parked and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes according to the security footage, before he got out and walked through the front door and told the deputy at the desk that he needed to talk to someone about what had happened behind Patsy's diner the previous night. Detective Rosa Medina had been on shift. She was 38, compact, with the patient and slightly exhausted manner of someone who had heard a great many stories and had learned to wait for the true one underneath. She put Connor Briggs in interview room 2 and brought him water he didn't drink and let him sit with himself for 4 minutes before she came in and sat across from him. He looked terrible. Not injured, unslept, unraveled, the particular wreckage of a person who had spent the night and most of the day sitting with something they couldn't outrun. "You want to tell me what happened?" she said. Connor looked at his hands. "Tyler was drunk," he said. We all were, but Tyler was really drunk, and when he drinks that much, he stopped, started again. The old man said something and Tyler pushed him. That's how it started. And then the guy went down and Tyler kicked him, and I said, stop. I said it to Marcus too. I said, we need to go. But then the girl, he pressed his palms to his eyes. She just threw herself over him. This tiny girl, I could see her shaking. She was terrified, and she did it anyway, and Tyler his voice broke, repaired itself. I froze. I should have pulled him off. I didn't. I just stood there, and then I panicked, and I got in the car, and He stopped again. "Mr. Briggs," Medina said quietly, "I need you to start from the beginning, and I need you to tell me everything." He did. It took 40 minutes. Medina didn't interrupt except to ask clarifying questions, and what emerged was a full account, not cleaned up, not strategic, just a raw and guilty memory of a man who had stood in a parking lot and watched something happen that he hadn't stopped. He told her about the other incidents, not just the 2 in the legal record, 3 more that never made it to police reports because Tyler's father had reached the victims first. When he was done, Medina looked at him for a moment. "You understand," she said, "that what you've just told me significantly changes the nature of these charges." Connor nodded. "And you came here voluntarily, without counsel." "I know. Why yet the hell?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because there were 400 bikers outside that hospital this morning, and it was on the news, and I sat in my motel room and watched it, and I thought about that girl's face when she put herself over that man." He stopped. "She didn't have anything. She didn't have anyone, and she did that. And I stood there." He looked at Medina. "I can't be someone who stood there and then helped cover it up. I can't do that." Medina left the room and called the district attorney's office. Emily found out about Connor Briggs from Gerald Brooks, who called her room at 5:40 and told her in the careful, factual way he delivered all information, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How many other incidents?" 5 total, Brooks said. 2 on record, 3 that we didn't know about. Connor named the victims. Medina's team is trying to locate them now. Emily was quiet. "Emily," Brooks said, "I want to prepare you for something. If those other victims are reached, and if any of them are willing to come forward, this becomes a pattern of conduct case. The charges against Tyler expand. The exposure for the Holloway family becomes substantially more serious." He paused. "But it also means this gets much larger, much more public. And it means the pressure on you to settle to make it stop is going to increase significantly." "Let it," she said. "You're sure?" "I've been invisible for a year," she said. "I've been walking around this city and people look right through me every single day. And Tyler Holloway looked at me and thought he saw the same thing. Nothing. Nobody." She stopped. "He's not the only one who's ever looked at me and seen nobody. But he's the one who hit me for it." She let that sit for a second. "I'm not settling. I want to be seen." Brooks was quiet for 3 seconds. "All right," he said. "Then we go to court." Jack was moved to a semi-private room the following morning, and Dennis Rourke was there when the nurses helped him settle in. And the first thing Jack said when he was situated was, "Where's Emily?" "Room down the hall," Dennis said. "She had a conversation yesterday afternoon that you need to hear about." Jack listened to the account of the 2 attorneys and Gerald Brooks in the lobby, and of Connor Briggs walking into the sheriff's substation, and of Emily's response when Brooks told her the case was getting larger. When Dennis finished, Jack was quiet. "She said she wants to be seen," Dennis said. Jack looked out the window. "Yeah," he said softly. "She would." "You knew her for 2 hours, Jack." "I know." He turned back. "Sometimes 2 hours is enough to know exactly who someone is." Dennis shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to reluctant admiration. "The attorneys have been trying to get access to her all morning. Patterson left 3 voicemails for Brooks. Richard Holloway apparently drove up from Phoenix last night and is staying at the hotel on Andy Devine. He came here personally. He came here personally." Jack was quiet again. "He's scared," he said finally. "He should be." "No," Jack said. "I mean actually scared. Not about money, about Tyler." He shifted carefully against the pillow. "Rich people with bad kids. Dennis, they spend their whole lives paying for what their kids do and telling themselves it's love and it's protecting family, but what they're actually protecting is the idea that their family is good, that they're good." He paused. "This is the first time Tyler's done something that can't be explained away. And Richard Holloway is sitting in a hotel room right now realizing he might have built the cage and left the door open and called it raising a son." Dennis looked at him. "That's almost sympathetic." "It's not sympathetic," Jack said. "He's going to use that fear to try to fix this the wrong way. Same as always, he just doesn't understand yet that there isn't a wrong way fix available." He looked at his splinted arm. "That girl isn't going to move." The second twist came from Marcus Webb. Not a confession. Not voluntarily, Marcus had lawyered up within 2 hours of the incident and was saying nothing which was strategically sound and personally cowardly in equal measure. What came from Marcus Webb came instead from his roommate, a 23-year-old named Derek Sosa, who had not been at the diner and had not witnessed anything, but had been listening to Marcus's phone calls for the past 18 hours and had his own particular relationship with guilt. Derek Sosa called the tip line at 8:47 the following morning and told the operator that Marcus Webb had been on the phone with his father, that he had detailed the events of the night with clarity, suggesting he was not nearly as drunk as he claimed in his initial statement to police, and that in the course of these conversations, Marcus had mentioned the name of the previous victim. He was most concerned about a 22-year-old woman named Sarah Colton, who had accepted a settlement of $60,000 18 months prior and signed an NDA that Marcus apparently believed was ironclad. Detective Medina had Sarah Colton's contact information by 9:15. The call she made at 9:30 lasted 22 minutes. Medina didn't describe the content of that call to anyone except the DA's office and Gerald Brooks, who received a brief summary at 10 a.m. that contained the words, "willing to provide testimony," and NDA being reviewed for enforceability under duress. Brooks called Emily at 10:20. "There's going to be a press conference today," he said. "The DA's office is going to announce expanded charges. Pattern of conduct prior victims. I need you to decide now whether you want to be present or whether you want to remain out of the public eye until trial." Emily had been sitting up for the first time that morning, her feet over the side of the bed, testing the particular new geography of breathing with 2 healing ribs and a recently re-expanded lung. Angela had been watching her with the focused attention of someone who was professionally committed to keeping her from overdoing it. "What do you think?" Emily said. "I think," Brooks said carefully, "that your presence changes the story. Right now in the media, you're the girl nobody knows. A homeless girl, a biker, an assault. When you're visible, when people can see who you actually are, the story becomes something different." He paused. "But visibility has costs. Richard Holloway's team will try to use it. Your past will be examined. The fact that you were homeless, that you aged out of foster care, they'll try to make that the narrative." "The narrative," Emily repeated. "They'll try to suggest that I'm somebody who has reasons to want money," she said. "That I'm lying or exaggerating or opportunistic." "Yes," she breathed carefully, tested the limit of the breath, stopped where it stopped. "They can try," she said. By noon, the number of motorcycles outside had decreased to roughly 80. Not because people had lost interest, because Dennis had asked those who'd come from greatest distance to go home, that Jack was going to be fine, that Emily was going to be fine, that the situation was in hand. About 80 had stayed. Some of them had been there for 30 hours. At 12:40, Tyler Holloway's lead attorney, not Patterson, a newer one, A woman named Cassandra Vale who billed at $900 an hour and had a reputation for surgical ruthlessness in civil court called Gerald Brooks. My client's father would like to meet with Emily Carter personally, Vale said. Without attorneys, just a conversation. No, Brooks said. I want to be clear that Mr. Holloway Sr. is not attempting to. No, Brooks said again. Emily Carter is a 19-year-old woman who is recovering from a collapsed lung in a hospital room. Richard Holloway is the father of the man who put her there. There is no version of a private meeting between those two people that is appropriate, and if one is attempted without my knowledge, I will treat it as witness intimidation and file accordingly. Silence on the line. Mr. Brooks, Vale said, and the surgical quality of her voice had acquired an edge. My client is prepared to be generous in ways that would materially change this young woman's life. My client's life, Brooks said quietly, is already changing, not because of your client's money, because she decided it would. He paused. We'll see you in court, Ms. Vale. He called Emily immediately after. Vale called, he said. Richard wants a private meeting. No. I already told her no. I wanted you to know it was attempted. He paused. Cassandra Vale is a serious attorney. She's going to go looking for anything that complicates your testimony, anything in your past, anything that creates doubt. Let her look, Emily said. Emily. Gerald. It was the first time she'd used his first name. I've been homeless for 11 months. Before that, I spent 15 years in the foster system. I have been examined and assessed and evaluated and found lacking by institutions my entire life. Her voice was steady, not angry, just absolute. There is nothing Cassandra Vale can find about me that is worse than what I've already survived. And I'm still here, and I was still the one who stayed. Brooks was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Find the other victims, Emily said. The ones Connor named, the ones Sarah Colton might know about. Find them and tell them what's happening and tell them they're not alone. She stopped. That's what I want. Not the money. That. What happened next took 48 hours and would eventually reshape the entire architecture of the case. Detective Medina and her team located 3 of the 5 victims Connor had named. 2 of them had signed NDAs. One had not a man named Paul Gert. 31, a former bartender who had been assaulted by Tyler outside a bar in Flagstaff 2 years earlier and had been offered a settlement. He refused because he'd been told informally that his word against Tyler's wasn't worth the fight. He hadn't signed anything. He had just given up. Medina drove to Flagstaff herself. She sat across from Paul Garrett in his kitchen and told him about Emily Carter and about Connor Briggs walking into the substation without a lawyer and about 400 motorcycles parked outside a hospital in Kingman. And Paul Garrett listened to all of it with the expression of a man who had carried something heavy for 2 years and was being offered for the first time the possibility of putting it down. She really turned down the money, he said. So far, Medina said carefully. A homeless girl we're in, nothing turned down whatever they offered her. Yes. Paul Garrett was quiet. Then he said, what do you need from me? Back in Kingman, Emily had a visitor she hadn't expected. Jack Morgan came to her room on his own feet, which he absolutely was not supposed to do, moving carefully in the way of a man with cracked ribs who had decided that moving carefully was a reasonable price for doing the thing he needed to do. He appeared in her doorway at 3:20 in the afternoon with his arm in a sling and his gray hair uncombed and a look on his face that she'd never seen before in anyone. Not pity, not admiration, but something rarer and harder to name. You're supposed to be in your room, she said, probably. He came in and sat in the chair beside her bed with the careful economy of a man minimizing the number of movements that would hurt. Brooks told me about the settlement offer, about Vale calling. You didn't have to walk down here for that. I know. He looked at her directly. I wanted to ask you something in person. Okay. Are you doing this because of me? He said, because you feel like you owe me something for what I did for you that night, or because you feel like you need to justify what happened to you, or... No, she said. You sure? Yes. She held his gaze. I'm doing it because of Sarah Colton, because of Paul Garrett, because of the 2 people who took money and had to stay quiet about what happened to them as she paused. I'm doing it because Tyler Holloway looked at me and saw nothing, and he's been looking at people and seeing nothing his whole life, and everyone around him has been letting that happen. She stopped. And I'm doing it because I'm tired of being nothing. Jack was quiet for a long time. Good, he said finally. The single word. Good, she repeated. That's a reason worth the cost, he said. The other's obligation, guilt, gratitude, those run out when it gets hard. And it's going to get hard. He looked at her steadily. But what you just said, that lasts. She looked at him. This man she'd known for 2 hours and then woken up in a hospital because of this man for whom 400 people had started engines in the dark. Why did you talk to me, she said, that night, behind the diner? You didn't have to. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because you were checking the perimeter, he said. 40 seconds of careful, systematic checking. And I thought whoever taught that girl to do that, they taught her something even if they taught it by being dangerous. He paused. And I thought someone who learned survival that young deserved to eat a hot meal and be talked to like a person for 20 minutes. He leaned back carefully. I didn't expect it to turn into 2 hours. Or this, she said. Or this, he agreed. She looked at her hands. You said send the club, she said. On the radio. What did you think was going to happen? I thought maybe 30 guys would show up, he said honestly. Maybe 50. Make some noise, make sure the police knew it was serious. He shook his head. I didn't expect 460. 460, she repeated. As of yesterday morning. He looked at the window. Dennis says there are still 80 in the parking lot. Emily sat with that for a moment. They don't know me, she said. Again, the same thing she'd said to Brooks. They know you covered me with your body when you had every reason to run, Jack said. To these men, to my men, that's not a small thing. That's not an abstract thing. He looked at her. They'd have come for any brother who called, but they stayed because of you. At 4:15, Gerald Brooks appeared in the doorway and saw Jack in the chair and said with the patience of a man who had learned not to waste energy on arguments he couldn't win, You're supposed to be resting. I am resting, Jack said. I'm sitting down. In the wrong room. Same building. Brooks looked at Emily, who carefully did not smile. He set a folder on her bedside table. The DA's office called, he said. They've received Paul Garrett's statement. The NDA review on Sarah Colton's settlement suggests the agreement may be unenforceable due to coercive circumstances at the time of signing. He opened the folder. And Connor Briggs has signed a full cooperation agreement. He paused. Tyler Holloway is being rearrested this afternoon. Upgraded charges. The bond is being reviewed. The room was very quiet. And Richard Holloway, Emily said. Brooks took off his glasses and cleaned them in the small, precise gesture she'd noticed he used when he was about to say something significant. Richard Holloway, he said, has fired Patterson and Grell and retained Cassandra Vale as his son's primary defense counsel, which tells me he's accepted that this is going to trial. He put his glasses back on. And this afternoon, he gave an interview to the Associated Press in which he described his son's actions as, quote, indefensible and expressed support for the victims. Jack looked at Brooks. He's positioning himself. He's positioning himself, Brooks confirmed, distancing from Tyler's conduct while keeping control of the narrative. It's a sophisticated move. Does it change anything? Emily said. Not for the criminal case, Brooks said. Tyler's conduct is Tyler's conduct. His father's public statements don't alter the evidence. He paused. But it does tell us that Richard Holloway has made a calculation. He's decided that Tyler is the sacrifice and that the way to protect the family name in the business is to get ahead of the story. Emily thought about what Jack had said. He might have built the cage and left the door open and called it raising a son. He's throwing Tyler under, she said. He's managing the damage, Brooks said. Whether that looks like throwing Tyler under depends on what Tyler decides to do with it. He picked up the folder, which is why the next 72 hours matter. Tyler is going to be facing significantly harder choices as of this afternoon. And how he responds, whether he fights, whether he tries to blame others, whether he tries to come after your credibility, will determine how we prepare. After Brooks left, Emily and Jack sat in silence for a while. Outside, the 80 who remained were still out there. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them, the way you feel something large and still at the edge of your awareness. He's going to try to make me look like nothing again, she said. Tyler, in court, that's what Vale's job is. Yes, Jack said. He didn't soften it. That doesn't scare me, she said. Not bravely, just as a fact. I know. She turned to look at him. Does it bother you that this is going to be big? That there are going to be cameras and reporters and the club's name is going to be in all of it? Jack was quiet for a moment. The club can handle its name, he said. We've been handling it for 40 years. He looked at her. Does it bother you that people are going to look at you, know about you, know your whole history? She thought about it honestly. Being unknown didn't keep me safe, she said. I was invisible, and I was hungry, and I was cold, and I was nobody for 11 months. She let that sit. I'll take known. Jack nodded slowly. Yeah, he said quietly. I think you will. He left her room at 5 o'clock and walked carefully back down the hallway to his own room, and Emily sat in the quiet that followed and listened to the sound outside, and she thought about Sarah Colton and Paul Garrett, and the two people who had stayed silent, and she thought about Tyler Holloway in a holding cell somewhere while his father gave careful interviews and his lawyer sharpened her knives. She thought about the word that Brooks had used, trial. And for the first time in 11 months, Emily Carter felt something she hadn't felt in so long. She almost didn't trust it. She felt like the ground under her was solid. The 72 hours after Tyler Holloway's rearrest were the longest of Gerald Brooks' 19 years as legal counsel for the Southwest chapters. Not because of the case itself, the evidence was solid, getting more solid by the hour, but because of what happened on the outside of the case in the space where money and pressure and media operated, and where the rules were different from anything written in a statute book. Cassandra Vale moved fast. Within 6 hours of Tyler's rearrest, she had filed 3 separate motions. One challenging the admissibility of Connor Briggs's statement on the grounds that he had given it without counsel and under psychological duress, one requesting a change of venue on the grounds that extensive media coverage had made a fair trial in Mojave County impossible, and one seeking to have Sarah Colton as ND reinstated pending a review of the coercion claims. The motions were professionally constructed and strategically timed, each one designed not necessarily to win, but to slow things down, to create friction, to buy time and wear people out. Brooks reviewed all 3 that evening in his motel room and called Emily at 9:45. She's playing a delay game, he said. The motions are serious enough to require responses, but not strong enough to succeed. She knows that. What does she actually want? Emily said. Oh, time, Brooks said. The longer this takes, the more chances there are for people to reconsider. Witnesses lose energy. Victims get tired. Media moves on. He paused. And she's hoping you get tired. Tell me something, Emily said. If I were somebody else, if I had money, if I had a family, if I had a house in a home and a history that looked normal, would she be filing these motions? Brooks was quiet for a moment. No, he said. She'd know they wouldn't hold. So she's filing them because she thinks I'm the kind of person who runs out of fight. That's my read. Okay, Emily said. Then let's make sure she finds out otherwise. The first motion was denied 11 days later. The second was denied 4 days after that. The third, the NDA challenge, took 3 weeks and resulted in a ruling that Sarah Colton's agreement had been signed under circumstances that significantly limited her freedom of informed consent and was therefore unenforceable as a gag provision. Sarah Colton was free to testify. She called Emily the evening the ruling came in. Emily didn't know what to expect from that call. She had been out of the hospital for 2 weeks by then, staying in a room that Dennis Rourke had arranged a spare bedroom in the home of a club member's wife in Kingman named Carol, who was 63, and made strong coffee and asked very few questions and had quietly put clean towels in the bathroom without making it a moment. Emily picked up the phone not knowing who Sarah Colton was. Beyond her name and what had happened to her, and the voice on the other end was younger than she'd imagined. 24 she knew from Brooks, but she sounded younger than that with the careful, measured quality of someone who had learned to control their voice, so it didn't give too much away. I wanted to call you directly, Sarah said. Gerald told me that was okay. It's okay, Emily said. A pause. I've been trying to figure out what to say for about 3 days. You don't have to say anything particular. I know. Another pause. I just wanted you to know when I took that money 18 months ago, I told myself it was practical, that fighting was going to cost more than it paid, that Tyler Holloway's family had more resources and more patience than I did, and that was just reality. Her voice tightened slightly. I still think all of those things were true. I still think if I'd fought then alone, I probably would have lost. Emily listened. But you're not alone, Sarah said, and I'm not alone anymore either. And I wanted to tell you that in person or close to it, that I'm coming to court and I'm going to say everything." She stopped. "And that you have no idea what it means that you didn't take the money." Emily's throat was tight. "You'd have done the same thing," she said. Sarah was quiet for a beat. "I don't know if I would have," she said honestly. "I hope so, but I don't know." She paused. "You had nothing, and you still said no." "I had nothing to lose," Emily said. "That's not the same as courage." "Yes, it is," Sarah said quietly. "That's exactly what courage is." The trial began on a Thursday morning in February, 4 months after the night behind Patsy's Diner. The Mojave County Superior Courthouse was not a large building, but it had acquired a charged quality in the days leading up to the start of proceedings, cameras on the sidewalk, the particular heightened atmosphere of an event that had grown beyond its original dimensions. The Tyler Holloway case had become, somewhere in the weeks between the arrest and the trial, a story that people were watching from places that had nothing to do with Kingman, Arizona. It had been covered in Phoenix and Los Angeles and Chicago, in papers that normally paid no attention to assault cases in small desert cities. The reason it had traveled that far had two parts. The first part was the 460 bikers. That image, the parking lot, the rows of motorcycles, the men standing in quiet formation outside a hospital, where a 19-year-old homeless girl was recovering from a collapsed lung, had moved through the internet with the velocity of things that strike people somewhere below the reasoning mind. It was the kind of image that didn't require explanation. The second part was Emily herself. Specifically, a brief statement she had given from her hospital bed 6 days after the incident, when a reporter from the Associated Press had requested through Gerald Brooks whether she'd be willing to answer 2 questions in writing. Brooks had advised against it. Emily had disagreed. The statement was 14 sentences long and had been read by 11 million people. She had written it herself longhand on a piece of notebook paper Angela had brought her, and it said what it said without legal softening: that she was 19 years old, that she had been living on the street for nearly a year, that she had met Jack Morgan 2 hours before the attack, that she had not protected him because of who he was or who his friends were, and that she had refused a settlement because the other people Tyler Holloway had hurt deserved to know they were not alone. The last line was the one that traveled furthest. It said, "Being invisible did not keep me safe. I'm done being invisible." Cassandra Vale had called that line, crafted for public sympathy, in an interview she gave 3 days later. Brooks had not responded to the comment. He didn't need to. The jury was seated on the second day of proceedings, 9 women and 3 men ranging in age from 27 to 68. Vale had worked hard during selection to remove anyone who appeared to have strong feelings about wealth disparity or institutional protection of the powerful. She had partially succeeded. But 12 people who had no feelings at all about wealth and power did not exist in Mojave County or anywhere else. And what she ended up with was a jury that looked at Tyler Holloway on the first day of proceedings with the particular careful blankness of people who were trying very hard to be fair. Tyler had cut his hair. He was wearing a suit that was expensive but not ostentatiously so, and he sat beside Vale with the controlled stillness of someone who had been extensively coached. He didn't look at Emily when she entered. Vale had told him not to, and he had, for once in his life, followed an instruction. His father was in the 3rd row. Richard Holloway was 61 years old and had the kind of face that spoke to a lifetime of authority, strong-jawed, silver-haired, the face of a man who had appeared on the covers of business publications and in the rooms where decisions were made. He sat with his hands folded and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man attending something painful and inescapable. He did not look at Emily either. She noticed both absences, the deliberate not looking of men who had learned that looking was acknowledgement. She looked at both of them directly and steadily and without heat, and then she turned her attention to the front of the room. The prosecution opened with 38 minutes of methodical, unhurried evidence presentation. Security footage from the diner's exterior camera enhanced and time-stamped. Medical documentation. Emily's Jack's The Clinical Language of Injury reports that somehow made everything more real rather than less, because the clinical language named the specific bones and the specific tissue and made abstract violence into a precise and documented thing. Connor Briggs's statement read into the record. Paul Garrett's account of his own prior experience establishing the pattern. Vale's opening argument was confident and carefully pitched. She did not dispute the assault entirely. The footage made that impossible. What she disputed was intent, context, degree of culpability. Tyler had been impaired. The situation had escalated in ways he hadn't controlled. The injuries, while serious, had to be weighed against his genuine remorse and his lack of prior criminal convictions. The prior civil settlements, she argued, were civil matters and spoke to his family's willingness to accept responsibility, not to a pattern of criminal conduct. She was good. Brooks had told Emily she was good, and she was. Emily watched her and thought, she's selling a story where I'm the size of the problem and Tyler is the size of a mistake, and she's doing it well. The first witness was Angela, the nurse. She described Emily's condition on arrival in the language of a medical professional, concise, precise, unemotional, and the precision was its own kind of weight. Collapsed lung, displaced rib, contusions consistent with repeated blows. The word repeated landed in the room and stayed there. Vale cross-examined for 11 minutes. She focused on the fact that Angela had not witnessed the assault, that her testimony was limited to medical findings, that she could not speak to context or sequence. Angela agreed to all of this calmly, and none of it moved the medical facts 1 inch. Connor Briggs took the stand on the second day. He looked worse than he had in his initial interviews, thinner, with the particular compressed quality of a person who had been carrying something heavy long enough that it had changed their posture. He told the story the same way he told it to Medina, without embellishment, without visible calculation. He named the moment Emily had thrown herself over Jack. He said the words, "I froze," with the particular flatness of someone who had repeated them to themselves enough times that the shame had become familiar. Vale cross-examined him for 40 minutes. She was surgical. She established that Connor had been drinking. She established that his voluntary statement had been given without counsel, that he had been in a highly emotional state, that his account of what Tyler specifically had done versus what could reasonably be attributed to confusion in a chaotic situation was not as precise as it might appear. Connor held up. He wasn't perfect. He stumbled twice on specifics of timing, but the core of what he said did not move. When he stepped down, he didn't look at Tyler. Tyler looked at him. For just a moment before Vale touched his arm and redirected his attention, Tyler Holloway looked at Connor Briggs with an expression that the court reporter interviewed by a journalist 3 months later described as something she had never forgotten. Not anger, not contempt. Something rawer than either of those. Something that looked, she said, almost like a person realizing for the first time that the story they had been telling about themselves was not the story other people had been watching. Sarah Colton testified on the 4th day. She was 24 years old, and she walked to the stand with the careful composure of someone who had made a decision and was going to keep it regardless of cost. She spoke clearly. She described what Tyler had done to her 18 months earlier, the contact with his father's representatives, the language of the settlement, offer the room where she had sat across from Patterson and Grell, and signed a document she had been told was standard and final and in her best interest. She said the words, "in my best interest," with a particular flatness that carried more weight than any inflection could have. Vale cross-examined her for 1 hour and 20 minutes. It was the most sustained pressure of the trial so far, and it was openly aggressive not toward Sarah as a person, but toward the facts of her testimony, each one examined and tested and challenged. The terms of the settlement, the timeline of events, whether she had been represented by counsel at signing, whether she had been told she could seek independent advice, whether she had fully understood what she was agreeing to. Sarah Colton answered every question in the same clear, measured voice. At the end of the cross-examination, Vale paused and then said, "Ms. Colton, you accepted $60,000 and signed a legal agreement. Isn't it true that at the time you believed that was a fair resolution?" Sarah looked at her. "No," she said. "I believed it was the only resolution available to me. Those aren't the same thing." The room was very quiet. Emily took the stand on the 7th day. She had spent 3 evenings with Brooks, preparing sitting across from him in Carol's kitchen, while Carol made coffee and occasionally appeared in the doorway with more of it. Brooks had walked her through everything Vale would likely do, the questions about her past, her time on the street, her relationship with Jack before the incident, the timing and sequence of events that night, the medical treatment she'd received, and from whom it had been paid for. That last part was what Vale would use if she could. The fact that the club had paid for Emily's medical care. The fact that Gerald Brooks was the club's attorney. The suggestion, however carefully worded, that Emily Carter's refusal to settle and her commitment to testifying were not entirely independent of the interests of the organization that had taken her in. Brooks had been direct about it. "She's going to imply you're a bought witness," he said. "Not in those words, but that's the structure." "And how do I handle that?" "By telling the truth," he said. "The truth is that you made the decision before the club was involved. The sequence is on your side. You said no to Tyler's men in the hospital before Dennis had made any promises, before I'd been retained, before any of this existed. The order of events matters. And if she implies otherwise, then you correct her, calmly, precisely, without anger." He looked at her steadily. Anger reads as defensive. Precision reads as truth. Emily walked to the stand on the 7th day carrying 11 months of invisibility and one night of refusing to be invisible, and she sat down and looked at the jury and then at Gerald Brooks, and she answered his questions in the direct, unembellished way she had learned to speak. Not because she'd been coached into simplicity, but because simplicity was what she had. She didn't have a lawyer's vocabulary or a storyteller's flourish. She had what happened. She described meeting Jack. She described the meal, the jacket, the 2 hours of conversation. She described Tyler and his friends arriving. She described the shove Jack going down, the sound of his elbow on the asphalt. She described putting herself between Tyler and Jack. "Why?" Brooks asked. The single word. She looked at the jury. "Because he was the first person in months who talked to me like I was a person who existed for my own reasons," she said. "Not a problem, not a charity case, not invisible. A person." She paused, and someone was trying to hurt him, and I wasn't going to be someone who stood there and let that happen. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something true has been said inside them. Vale's cross-examination began after the lunch break. She was controlled and professional and came at Emily from 3 directions over the course of 90 minutes. The first direction was the relationship with the club, the medical bills, the attorney, the room she was staying in. Emily answered each question with the sequence of events precisely and without heat. She had said no to the settlement before Dennis had made any commitment. She had asked for Brooks before Brooks had offered. The timeline was the timeline. The second direction was her history. Not cruelly, Vale was too skilled for cruelty that showed but persistently. The foster system, the aging out, the 11 months on the street, establishing a portrait of a young woman with no stable history, no fixed address, no consistent relationships. Emily answered all of it. She did not apologize for any of it. "You were homeless," Vale said. "You had no income, no insurance, no resources." "Yes." "And when my client's family offered you a financial settlement, you refused." "Yes." "Can you help the jury understand why someone in your position would refuse financial assistance that could have materially improved your circumstances?" Emily looked at her. Then she said, "Because the money wasn't for me. It was to make Tyler Holloway's problem go away. And I wasn't willing to be the tool that made his problem go away when there were other people he'd hurt who had already been made into that tool and had to live with it." She paused. "I had nothing, but I had that choice, and I made it." Vale moved to the third direction. The night itself, the sequence of events, whether Emily could be certain of what she saw, whether the poor lighting, the shock, the pain had affected her perception, whether her memory was reliable. Emily was patient. She answered each question with what she remembered and said clearly when she wasn't certain of a specific detail, and the certainty she did express was unshakable because it was about the things you don't forget. The sound of Jack going down, the decision to move, the feeling of his ribs under her hands when she covered him, the pain when it came. "You were terrified," Vale said. "You've said that." "Yes. And in that state of terror, you believe your perceptions were accurate." "I believe what I felt was accurate," Emily said. "When something breaks inside you, you know it. When someone keeps hitting you when you're down, you know it. Those things don't become uncertain because you were scared." Vale looked at her for a moment. Then she said no further questions. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. During those hours, Emily sat with Jack in Carol's living room. And they didn't talk much, which was a thing she had come to understand was one of the things she valued about him. His ability to simply exist in a room with someone without needing to fill it. Carol brought food neither of them ate much of. Gerald Brooks called twice with procedural updates. Dennis Rourke sent a single text message that read simply, "We're here." On the second afternoon, Jack said, "Whatever happens in there, you did what you came to do." "I know," she said. "I mean that. Not as a consolation, as a fact." He looked at her. "Sarah Colton is going to be okay because of what you did. Paul Garrett is going to be okay. The others, whatever that jury decides." "I want the jury to decide right," Emily said. "So do I." "I want him to be accountable," she said. "Not for me. I'm going to be okay regardless. I know that now." She looked at her hands. "For every person who believed that his money was the whole truth of the situation. I want there to be a moment where it isn't." The verdict came at 3:18 on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on the primary assault charge, guilty on the pattern of conduct enhancement, guilty on the charge stemming from the prior assault on Paul Garrett, which had been added to the indictment after the investigation expanded. The foreman read each one in the same steady voice, and with each one, Tyler Holloway became very still, the particular stillness of someone watching their own certainties collapse one by one. Richard Holloway in the third row did not move, did not change expression. He sat with his hands folded exactly as they had been on the first day, and Emily, who turned briefly to look at him when the last verdict was read, thought that she understood something about him in that moment that she hadn't expected to understand. He was not surprised. He had known somewhere underneath the lawyers, in the motions, in the careful public statements, that this was where it ended. He had known because some part of him had always known what his son was and had spent 26 years making the consequences go away, and now they had arrived at the place where they couldn't. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she understood him. Outside, Dennis Rourke was standing on the courthouse steps with 8 other men, and when Brooks came through the door and gave him a single nod, Dennis took off his helmet and held it in both hands and looked at the sky for a long moment. When Emily came through the door, blinking in the afternoon light, he looked at her with the same expression she'd seen on his face the first morning in her hospital room, that careful measuring appraisal, but warmer now, the measurement already done and the conclusion already made. "Well," he said. "Well," she said back. He shook his head slowly. "Jack called it," he said. "From the beginning. He said you weren't going to move. He was right. He usually is." Dennis looked at her. "You know what he said to me the morning after, when I told him that they were offering you money?" "What?" He said, and I want to get this exactly right, because Jack hates being misquoted. He said, "She stayed when she had every reason to run. She's not going to run now." Dennis paused. "And I said, 'How do you know you knew her for 2 hours?' And he said 2 hours was enough." Emily stood in the afternoon light and thought about a parking lot and a plastic crate and a plate of biscuits and gravy and a man who had talked to her like she was a person who existed for her own reasons. 2 hours, everything that had come from 2 hours. Inside the courthouse, the sentencing date was being set. Tyler Holloway was being processed. Cassandra Vale was already working on appeals that she and everyone else in that room knew were unlikely to succeed. And Emily Carter stood on the courthouse steps in the February sun and felt the ground under her feet as solid and permanent as anything she had ever stood on, and understood with the clarity that only comes to people who have survived long enough to earn it, that the invisible girl was gone. What stood in her place was someone the world was going to have to account for. The sentencing happened on a Tuesday morning in late March, 6 weeks after the verdict. Tyler Holloway stood before Judge Patricia Wren and received 8 years on the primary assault charge, with the pattern of conduct enhancement adding 30 months on top of that. The sentence was not the maximum possible, but it was far from the minimum. And when Judge Wren read it into the record, she looked at Tyler directly and said something that would be quoted in the coverage that followed. "This court has reviewed the full record of conduct presented in this case. What that record reflects is not a single moment of poor judgment. It reflects a sustained pattern of violence against people you believed had no recourse. This court is the recourse." Tyler received the sentence without visible reaction. He had been coached into stillness by Cassandra Vale, and he maintained it, which was professionally correct and humanly eerie. The absolute absence of response from a person hearing the years of his life being counted out in a courtroom. His father in the third row again bowed his head when the number was read. Not in prayer, in something else. Something private that Emily, sitting 2 rows behind the prosecution table, chose not to try to name. Outside, Gerald Brooks shook her hand and said, "That's a significant sentence. Is it enough?" she said. He considered this with the seriousness she had come to expect from him. For you and Jack, medically and legally, yes. For Sarah Colton, probably. For Paul Garrett. He paused. No sentence gives Paul Garrett back the 2 years he spent believing he had no recourse. But it tells him, going forward, that he did. He looked at her. Is it enough for you? She thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a year. He almost smiled. I will. What happened in the months between the sentencing and that year were things Emily had not let herself imagine when she was sleeping behind dumpsters and keeping herself invisible and surviving one day at a time with $17 and a broken zipper on her sleeping bag. The first thing that happened was the ID. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. When you have been out of the system long enough, when you have no fixed address and no documentation trail, when you are a person who exists only in the gaps between official records, getting identification requires a specific kind of sustained institutional navigation that is exhausting and humiliating in ways that are hard to explain to people who have never had to do it. You need a birth certificate to get an ID, and you need an ID to get a birth certificate, and the circle is sealed and guarded by offices with limited hours and requirements. You can't meet without the thing you're trying to get. Brooks cut through it, not illegally, through the specific knowledge of which offices to contact in which order and which legal provisions existed for exactly this circumstance. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Emily Carter had a state-issued ID with her name and her photograph and her current address, Carol's house for the time being, and she held it in her hands and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Jack was there when it arrived. He looked at her holding it and said nothing because he understood what it meant without needing it explained. It's just a card, Emily said finally. No, Jack said. It isn't. She looked up at him. I exist now, she said. Officially. You existed before, he said. Now the paperwork agrees. The second thing was the GED. She had dropped out of high school in her junior year. Not dramatically, not because of a single event, but because the foster placement she was in at the time changed, and the new placement was in a different district, and the enrollment process required documentation. Her placement worker hadn't yet completed, and by the time the documentation was in order, she was 3 months behind and had no tutoring and no support, and the math of catching up with no resources had simply not resolved in her favor. She had stopped going, and no one had followed up, which was the most ordinary possible version of a system failing a child. She started the GED prep program in April at a community education center in Kingman. She went 4 mornings a week. She sat in a room with adults ranging in age from 21 to 57, and she worked through the material with the focused, economical attention of someone who has learned to treat every resource as finite and therefore worth using fully. She passed in June, all 5 sections, first attempt. Dennis found out before she had a chance to tell anyone and showed up at Carol's house that evening with Jack and 3 other men from the local chapter and a cake that Carol had clearly been complicit in, and Emily stood in Carol's kitchen looking at the cake and at these men who took up a significant amount of the available space and felt something she had difficulty categorizing. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, more like the feeling of something completing itself. You didn't have to do this, she said. We know, Dennis said. It's a GED, she said. It's not, a lot of people have GEDs. A lot of people didn't pass it while recovering from a punctured lung and testifying in a felony trial, Jack said. He looked at her steadily. Accept the cake, Emily. She accepted the cake. Carol cut it, and Emily ate 2 pieces, which was notable because for the first 6 weeks after the hospital, she had struggled to eat consistently, a physical consequence of the injury, and a psychological one too, the body's way of processing what it had been through. The appetite coming back fully was its own quiet milestone. Sarah Colton called that evening. She called to congratulate Emily on the GED, which meant Brooks had told her, which meant the informal network of people who had become invested in Emily Carter's life was larger and more communicative than Emily had fully mapped. She was still getting used to that, the experience of being known by people who wanted good things for her. It sat differently than she'd expected, not uncomfortably but unfamiliarly, like a sound she wasn't yet calibrated to. I have news too, Sarah said. Tell me. I got accepted to the paralegal program at Phoenix College, Sarah said. I start in September. A pause. I've been wanting to be in law since I was 12 years old. After what happened with Tyler, I thought that was over, that I'd let it be over. Her voice shifted slightly. I didn't let myself try again until I watched you go to court. Emily didn't know what to say to that. You don't have to say anything, Sarah said, reading the silence correctly. I just wanted you to know. I'm proud of you, Emily said. It came out simply because it was simply true. We're proud of each other, Sarah said. That's how this works now. The third thing, the thing Emily had not anticipated and had not asked for, and which arrived like a freight train disguised as a phone call, was the foundation. It started with Dennis. He came to Carol's house one evening in late July with Brooks and a man Emily hadn't met before, a quiet, precise man named Howard Katz, who turned out to be a nonprofit attorney. And they sat in Carol's living room, and Dennis said, "We want to talk to you about something. And before we talk about it, I want to be clear that you can say no and nothing changes. This is not a condition of anything." Emily looked at the three of them. "That's a significant preamble," she said. "The story got big," Dennis said. "You know that. The coverage, the trial, your statement, it got big in ways that are still going. We've been getting calls from organizations, from individuals, from people who want to," he stopped, apparently finding the word, "who want to do something with what happened, not exploit it, use it." "Use it how?" Emily said. Brooks took it from there. "There is significant donor interest," he said carefully, "in establishing a fund specifically for youth aging out of the foster care system in Arizona. The kind of support that could prevent the situation you were in, the 3-day cliff, the $40, the garbage bag. Transitional housing, documentation assistance, a connection to legal services." He paused. "The interest is real, the money is real, but the foundation needs a face and a director, and the people involved believe, and Howard and I agree, that it should be someone who has lived what it's trying to prevent." Emily looked at Howard Katz. "You're a nonprofit attorney." "Yes," he said. "And you'd structure this." "That's correct." "And you came to me." "We came to you," Dennis said. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Carol moving around in the kitchen, the familiar sound of Carol's evening routine, and she thought about 11 months of learning to hear everything around her, because everything around her could be a threat. And how strange it was that the same hyper-awareness that had been a survival mechanism had become something else, the ability to read rooms, to know when people meant what they said. These three men meant what they said. "I don't have a degree," she said. "You'll get one," Brooks said. "Howard has identified an accelerated social work program at NAU that accepts non-traditional students with demonstrated field experience. You'd qualify." "You've already looked into this," she said. "We wanted to have answers if you had questions," Howard said. She looked at Jack, who had not been in the room for this conversation. She'd learned that Jack was deliberate about removing himself from moments where his presence might feel like pressure. But she knew what he would say if she asked him. She knew because she knew him now, 3 months of knowing him, and 3 months was enough for some things. 2 hours had been enough for one thing. "I want to think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need," Dennis said. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about the foster placements and the documentation circles and the $40 and the broken zipper. She thought about the girls she'd met on the street, the ones still there, the ones she'd watched navigate the specific cruelty of being 18 and suddenly no one's problem. She thought about what Brooks had said in the hospital. Her problem was that she almost died, and what she wanted from that was accountability. She'd gotten that. Now the question was what she wanted from everything that came after. On the 4th day, she called Brooks. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, Howard will start the paperwork. One condition," she said. "Name it. I want Sarah Colton involved, if she wants to be." She paused. "She's going into paralegal work. She knows what the legal side of this looks like from the inside. And she's someone who went through it and came out." She stopped. "People need to see that it's survivable. Both of us together shows that better than either of us alone." Brooks said, "I'll call her today." Sarah said yes before he finished the sentence. The Carter Colton Foundation for Youth Transition. Carol had insisted on hyphenating the names, and Emily had been too startled by the suggestion to object, and then had decided Carol was right, filed its nonprofit paperwork in September. The name was Emily's idea, and Brooks had tried gently to suggest she considers something less personal, and she had said, "The point is that it's personal. The point is that this comes from somewhere real. If the name on it is real, people understand that. He had agreed. Jack was there the day the approval came through. He had driven to Kingman, specifically 4 hours each way, and sat in Carol's kitchen with a cup of coffee while Emily read the approval letter on her laptop. And when she looked up, he was watching her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of emotion contained present, the feeling held rather than displayed. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about it. "Like when I got the ID," she said. "Like something that should have existed already finally exists." He nodded slowly. "What do you need to make it work?" "Office space eventually, volunteers initially, a website that Howard's nephew is building." She paused. "And someone who knows a lot of people in Arizona who might be willing to spread the word." Jack looked at her over his coffee cup. "I might know someone like that," he said. "I thought you might." The charity fundraiser happened in November 1 year and 3 weeks after the night behind Patsy's Diner. Dennis had organized it with the particular efficiency of a man who had organized larger and more complicated events and had the logistical instincts of someone used to coordinating hundreds of people across multiple states. It was held in a rented hall in Kingman, neutral ground. Dennis had said somewhere between the courthouse and the highway, somewhere that belonged to the story they'd all been part of. Emily had not known what to expect from the evening. She had stood in front of people twice now in a hospital room and in a courtroom, and both times she had known what she needed to say because the situation had defined it. This was different. This was a room of people who were on her side, which was paradoxically harder because their goodwill required something from her that opposition never did. It required her to be fully present, to let people see her without the armor of necessity. She was getting better at that, slowly. She stood at the front of the room and looked out at the crowd, the writers, the local people who had followed the case. Angela, the nurse who had driven from her shift, Detective Medina, who was off duty and sitting in the back with a glass of water, Paul Garrett, who had driven from Flagstaff and was standing near the door with the particular alertness of someone still practicing the idea that rooms could be safe. Sarah Colton was in the front row with Howard Katz beside her, and Carol was sitting beside Sarah wearing the blue dress she'd mentioned 3 times she'd been saving for something good. And Jack was in the third row, slightly to the left of center, in a chair that was a little too small for him, with his arm healed now and his gray hair combed and his vest on, because Jack Morgan was constitutionally incapable of attending any event without his vest, which was something Emily had come to understand was not an affectation but an identity. She started talking. She told the truth the way she had learned to tell it, directly without apology, without the softening that made things easier to hear, but less true. She told them what 11 months on the street actually felt like, not the surface version, but the interior one, the specific shame of invisibility, the way you learn to make yourself smaller, the way your own sense of your existence begins to thin when no one responds to you as a person for long enough. She told them about the night behind the diner, and the biscuits and gravy, and a man who talked to her like she was a person who existed for her own reasons, and she saw Jack look down at his hands. She told them about the hospital and the 400 motorcycles and what it had meant to be in a room where someone was fighting for her, not because she had earned it in any transactional sense, but simply because she was a person and a person had hurt her, and that was enough. She told them about saying no to the money. She told them about Sarah, about Paul, about the two who had stayed silent, whom she did not name, but whose weight she had carried through everything, the understanding that the only difference between her and them was the order in which things had happened and the presence of 400 motorcycles in a parking lot. She told them what the foundation was and what it was going to do. And then she stopped, and she looked out at the room, and she said the last thing, the thing she had not planned, but which arrived in that moment fully formed the way true things sometimes do. "A year ago," she said, "I had a rule. Stay invisible. Never get involved. Never become someone's problem. And I kept that rule for 11 months because I believed that being nobody was the price of surviving." She paused. "Jack Morgan bought me dinner and talked to me like a person, and then somebody tried to hurt him, and I broke the rule." She looked at Jack, who was still looking at his hands. "I broke it because he'd made me remember in 2 hours that I was somebody. And you can't go back to being nobody once you've remembered that." She let the room be quiet for a moment. "He says I saved him," she said, "but he saved me first. He just did it so quietly with biscuits and gravy and a jacket that was definitely not too small for him that I almost didn't notice. She heard Carol laugh somewhere in the middle of the room, a real laugh, and it steadied her. Every kid aging out of foster care this year is keeping a version of my rule. Stay invisible. Don't be a problem. Don't need too much, because needing too much when you have nothing is dangerous. She stopped. This foundation exists to change that math, to be the dinner and the jacket before the crisis, to tell those kids before anything terrible has to happen that they're somebody, that they exist for their own reasons, that they matter. She looked at the room. That's all, she said. Thank you for being here. The room came to its feet, not all at once. It started in the back with a man she didn't know who just stood up, and then it moved forward like a wave. And within 10 seconds, there was no one sitting, and the sound was not applause in the ordinary sense, but something fuller than that, the sound of people who had been part of something and understood what they had been part of. Emily stood at the front of the room and let it happen. She looked at Jack, who was standing with everyone else, and he was not applauding. He was just standing with his hands at his sides, looking at her with the expression she had finally learned to name. It was the expression of a man who had been right about something important and was glad to have been right and was already characteristically thinking about what came next. She almost smiled. He caught it and almost smiled back. Dennis leaned over to the man beside him and said something, and the man nodded, and later Emily would find out that what he'd said was Jack called it from night one, which was true and which Dennis would say again at other moments in the years that followed, because it was the kind of true thing that bore repeating. After the room settled, after people came to talk to her, and she shook hands and listened and answered questions and accepted the particular warmth of a crowd that wanted good things for you, Emily found a moment to stand beside Jack at the edge of the room. "You saved mine first," he said. It was what he always said. She had learned that it wasn't a deflection. It was his way of naming what had happened accurately, not giving her credit and in a way that diminished what she had received, but insisting on the mutuality of it, that they had saved each other, that it had gone both ways and that both directions mattered. "We're even then," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "You were nicer about it. I bought you dinner first. You just went straight to the saving." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind she could hear herself now, without it startling her, the kind that had come back fully somewhere in the months of Carol's coffee and Brooks's careful legal information and Sarah's phone calls and Dennis's logistical efficiency and Jack's particular brand of quiet present companionship. It was the laugh of a person who knew she was a person. Sarah appeared at Emily's elbow with 2 glasses of water and said, "Paul Garrett wants to talk to you. He drove from Flagstaff. I told him you'd find him." "I'll find him," Emily said. She spent the next hour moving through the room, finding the people who needed finding. Paul Garrett, who shook her hand with both of his and said simply, "Thank you," and meant something much larger than the words. Angela, who hugged her and said she was proud and that she'd been telling the story to every new patient who needed to hear that things could turn around. Detective Medina, who told her that the expanded investigation had led to the review of Tyler Holloway's civil settlements across 3 states and that 2 additional victims had come forward in connection with those reviews. 2 more, Emily said. 2 more, Medina confirmed, both cooperating. The civil exposure for the Holloway family is significant. She paused. Richard Holloway's attorneys reached out to our office last month. He's cooperating with the review. Emily absorbed this. Why? Medina looked at her. Because his son is in prison and his business is under scrutiny, and because I think somewhere under all of it, he knows. She paused. Some people get to the truth the hard way. He's getting there. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't have anything to say about Richard Holloway that felt both honest and kind, so she said nothing, which Jack had taught her by example was always an option. Before the evening ended, she found a quiet moment by herself. Just a minute, long enough to stand still and let the noise of the room recede slightly and feel one more time the ground under her feet. She thought about the girl who had come around the corner of Patsy's diner 13 months ago, with her hands shaking from hunger and her eyes trained to see everything and show nothing. The girl who had a rule and kept it and kept it and kept it until a 64-year-old man with a gray beard and a plate of canned biscuits had undone it in 2 hours without meaning to. She thought about everything the rule had cost her, the year of cold and hunger and invisibility, the practiced smallness, The way she had walked through this city like a ghost present, but unacknowledged, surviving but not living. She thought about what breaking the rule had cost her. 2 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, 4 months of legal proceedings, the exposure of her entire history to a courtroom and a media cycle in the permanent public record. She thought about what breaking the rule had given her: an ID, a GED, a room that was hers, a foundation with her name on it: Sarah, Paul, Angela, Medina, Carol and her blue dress and her strong coffee and her quiet generosity, Dennis and his logistical efficiency and his rare, real respect, Gerald Brooks and his glasses cleaning habit and his willingness to go to court for nothing against everything. Jack. She thought about Jack. And she thought about the $17 she'd had in her pocket the night she covered his body with hers. And she thought about the 460 men who had started engines in the dark because he'd said 3 words on a frequency they monitored. And she thought about the way the world had turned out to be larger and more populated with decency than 11 months of invisibility had allowed her to believe. Carol appeared at her elbow. "You okay?" she said. "Yes," Emily said. Carol looked at her the way she always looked at her, directly without fuss. "You going to be okay? Going forward." Emily thought about the foundation paperwork and the NAU application that was already in, and the office space Brooks had identified, and the list of organizations they were already in contact with, and Sarah's voice on the phone, and Paul Garrett's 2-handed handshake, and the permanent, solid quality of the ground under her feet. "Yes," she said again, and this time the word had the weight of something she had earned. Carol nodded once satisfied and went back into the crowd. Emily stood for another moment. Then she straightened and turned and walked back into the room full of people who knew her name. The girl who had learned to be invisible had done something harder and more permanent than anything surviving had ever asked of her. She had learned to be seen, and she was never going back.